everybody!
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up. Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very special episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today, because today we are continuing our book recommendations series. We put out a post on Twitter to have people share with us books that they would recommend for fans of the First Law Trilogy. You read First Law Trilogy, you loved it. What can you read next that has a similar kind of flavor? And Twitter answered, and we have our own replies as well, and we're just excited to get into it.
Yes, we are absolutely pumped to get into it. Joe Abercrombie's work is some of our absolute favorite of anything that we've read.
Undoubtedly.
That's probably clear by all the First Law character profiles and stuff that we've been doing to just keep talking about it. So I think that we hopefully have a lot of First Law fans who have been tuning in, and we want to be able to guide them in the right direction in case they've already read all of Joe's work and they want to know what else is worth checking out.
That's right, and it's important to note, I think that this is a spoiler-free episode. We're just going to drop some names and why we think, like, what their similarities are for First Law fans, what First Law fans might enjoy from these recommendations. And yeah, just loving to talk more books, more fantasy all day long. But none of this would have been possible without our fellow fantasy enthusiasts over on Twitter. Isn't that right, Dylan?
That's right, and I want to thank all the wonderful folks who helped share this request out to their followers too. Without your help, we wouldn't have gotten such a outpour of recommendations that are going to help make this episode that much better. So I want to say thank you to Carrie at I Can Has Books. Thank you to Words Matter at Jenny K and Z. Thank you to Jillian Redfern, who's a deputy publisher, and that's at Jillian Redfern. Thank you to Dirk Ashton, an author and Spiffbo finalist, author of the Paternus trilogy, and that's at Dirk. And also thank you to the Winds of Time podcast at the Winds of, who is a fellow podcast. And we also got a quote tweet from Lou Abercrombie, and of relation to Joe Abercrombie. That's Joe Abercrombie's spouse at Lady Grimdark on Twitter, who quote tweeted the GIF I shared of Joe Abercrombie alongside this and said, "Ooh, look, a GIF of Joe."
And you made that GIF yourself, right, Dylan?
Right. Yes,
Very
that's
nice
a
work.
homemade Dylan at the FTF podcast GIF. I'm always trying to make those. So
That's an FTF original.
Right. It was before I really got into rhythm of figuring out how to make GIFs, and it was one of the first ones I made, so it did take me a while, and I was like, is all of this going to be at all worth it? And then Joe Abercrombie's wife enjoyed it, and I was like, yes, this is all worth it. So I was very happy.
I definitely say so. That will, that tweet was blessed by the Abercrombie dynasty. So very exciting to kick off these recs. I'm going to go into a few of mine really quickly. There were some that were mentioned by other users, so I might skip those for now, actually, and come back to them. But one that was not mentioned by anyone that I think is one of my personal favorites. It's The Magicians by Lev Grossman. And the Magician's is not grimdark by any means, and I know like Joe Abercrombie's Lord Grimdark on Twitter, so people are probably expecting a lot of grimdark Rex, which we have, but Magician's to me stands out not for being grimdark, but for great characterization, great sense of humor, and the willingness to depart from a lot of the common fantasy tropes. It's fresh, it's modern, it's got an incredibly vibrant voice that comes through from the author, much like Joe's prose is very vibrant as
Nailed it.
well. And I would say, and Dylan, I'm going to toss this over to you, but I would say both have a really good sense for psychology and just kind of like the human condition, right?
I would definitely agree with that. I did read The Magicians before enrolling in my graduate program for counseling psychology, but I do remember at the time thinking that it was the best portrayal of depression that I've ever seen
Hmm,
from The
definitely.
Magicians. And the way that it's explored with just a really realistic, dare I say it, Charles,
Oh, you went there
approach to
already.
what depression most commonly looks like, I would say, uh, is really impressive from Lev Grossman. So props to him. And of course, it goes without saying that Joe Abercrombie consistently displays a deep understanding of psychology with his characters in the First Law series.
Well said. So, if you liked First Law series and you're looking for a little bit of a departure from Swords and Sorcery, but still in these great characters, great sense of humor, take a good look into characterization, check
Right.
out The Magicians by Lev
Hmm.
Grossman.
Yeah.
The other series I wanted to bring up super quickly that no one brought up, which surprised me, and it might not be for the
Mm.
traditional reasons you might think of, but it's The Lord of the Rings.
I
Now, hear me out, everybody. You have to say you got something on your mind, Dylan.
Yeah, I mean, I just can't believe the second thing we're going to talk about in a recommendations for Joe Abercrombie books is going to be The Lord of the Rings. When the book, I know where you're going to go with this, Charles, so I will hear you out, and I invite our listeners to do the same. But as a big fan of modern grimdark fantasy, it is hard for me to just sit quietly while that rises to second on a list of recommendations for
Now
Lord
that's fair.
Grimdark's
Very
work.
fair, very fair. But, I had my recommendations, and these books were the only two books that didn't already come up. So I wanted to get them out of the way.
Okay.
And it's kind of bizarre to recommend Lord of the Rings to fantasy fans out there. But, like yourself, Dylan, you had read Joe Abercrombie well before you read Lord of the Rings. And
Right.
here's why I'm recommending it. And it's simply because so that you can fully appreciate what Joe Abercrombie is subverting or, dare I say,
Hmm.
lampooning throughout
Whoa.
the First Law. I mean, there's so many great moments that happen in the First Law series that I'm not going to get into, but you can obviously see that he's paralleling Lord of the Rings at certain times and having fun with that and having fun with those tropes. And Dylan, you have the benefit of reading these in the order that I'm suggesting now. You read Abercrombie first, Lord of the Rings second. Don't you kind of appreciate what Abercrombie was doing a little bit more after having read Lord of the Rings?
Right. There are scenes that I see in the First Law where I can now tell that they're pretty directly subverting specific things that happened in the Lord of the Rings books, and I don't want to
Mm-hmm.
go into details because of spoilers for potentially both those series. But I did gain a new appreciation for some of the ways that Abercrombie is subverting these tropes. I will also say that Lord of the Rings does not come to mind for me if someone had just
Yeah.
read the First Law and they're looking for what they should be reading
Yes.
next.
Agreed.
I don't think, oh yeah, like definitely check out the like the Lord of the Rings, you'll love it. I'm like, okay, well, if you're seasoned with this grimdark stuff and you want to check something out, then like uh, I don't know. I think that there's a lot of grimdark and gritty dark fantasy. I would say you could probably
Oh yeah, I'm like
find
if you're going
before
into
you want
this
to go
looking
back
for
to
the
Lord of the
next
Rings. Yeah.
entertaining read, maybe stick along the grimdark veins. But if you want to kind of fully appreciate what's going on in the world of grimdark and especially Joe Abercrombie's work, these books are worth picking up, if only for
For
that, if
sure.
not being the most famous
Yeah.
fantasy series ever. And we can move on now. We've got tons and tons and tons of user submitted grimdark fantasy. So let's just get right into one of the big ones here. We have user district_UTE who
Ute.
Ute who goes on to say, this may be too obvious, but a Song of Ice and Fire series, dark, gray areas, evolving characters, humor, violence, and complex plot. And this was at the top of my recommendations list too, and I agree 100%. It might be too obvious to be like, hey, if you've read Abercrombie but not read like Game of Thrones, go pick it up. I mean, it's kind of understood, I think, by a lot of fantasy fans. But just in case you're in this group that's read Joe Abercrombie and not George Martin, definitely pick up A Song of Ice and Fire. There's so many really interesting parallels. Like the stories are told in a very similar way, where each chapter is like a different POV, or it bounces around different POVs, and a lot of characters kind of parallel each other, and they're both really great, modern, outstanding voices in fantasy.
Well said, Charles, and I do appreciate District Ute, who's at S_Glouse18
Mm-hmm.
on Twitter, bringing this to our attention. I think we'd be remiss not to talk about A Song of Ice and Fire here, although you think of it typically in the reverse direction of how we're talking about now, where it's more like someone who's liked Game of Thrones and maybe gone on to read A Song of Ice and Fire might say, what should I read next? And you and I would be very quick to say, well, check out The First Law. That's a
Yes.
great next
Very
step for
common that we
you.
do that. And we did
Yeah,
that,
so
actually.
oh yes, we do have a book recommendations for A Song of Ice and Fire episode, and First Law might have been the first thing we talked
It
about
was right at the
there.
top of the list for sure.
Right. So it usually goes the opposite way, but if you're someone who's had a unique path to this gritty dark fantasy that started with Abercrombie and you haven't checked out A Song of Ice and Fire yet, of course, makes a lot of sense to grab that as your next read. And people know about Song of Ice and Fire, so let's keep it rolling, Charles.
Agreed. We have the great Fantology stopping by at
Ooh.
Fantology_books. You may know them from our collaborations. They helped us kick off Wheel of Time. We went over recently to talk about the end of the Poppy War series. So, your ears should perk up when they're coming out with recommendations, because they're super knowledgeable, and
Right.
they put out some really great ones. So I'm just going to get into what they said here. If you want more grimdark after Lord Grimdark's experience, I'd say Rebecca Kwong at KwongRF provides a different flavor focused more on the speculative fiction side, and at Evan Winter, who has written The Rage of Dragons, is a little gritty too, although not as much as these. Also, at Scott Lynch 78, his books are fantastic.
Right, and that's Scott Lynch, author of the Gentleman Bastard series.
Yes,
and
a
Charles,
series
you
I'm
can't
very
just...
familiar with.
Yes,
I was going to recommend
by...
Gentleman Bastards for this book. I was like, go read it, guys, even though I haven't.
Yes. So, Charles, that's been the really difficult one to get Charles to accept in our Friends Pitching Fantasy segments, has been Gentleman Bastard. But don't you worry, Gentleman Bastard fans. Don't you worry, Benjamin, if you're listening. We will find a way to get Charles to read the Gentleman Bastard series at some point. And maybe this endorsement from Fantology Podcast will help, Charles, because you love The First Law. You love how those books are both gritty and dark while also being very humorous.
Yes.
And that's what I would say sticks out that makes Scott Lynch's Gentleman Bastard, beginning with The Lies of Locke Lamora, a very good recommendation for fans of Joe Abercrombie's work. I think that's the hardest part, is that balance of the grim darkness, although I don't know if I'd quite call Gentleman Bastard grimdark, but the darkness anyway, like gritty and dark and willing to have a lot of messed up things happen. Scott Lynch certainly is willing to do that, but he's also very, very funny. It's got amazing dialogue, great characters, and all those things, the way they're balanced with the darkness, I think is something that fans of Joe Abercrombie would really appreciate.
That's good to hear. Doesn't surprise me at all. For the record, Dylan has to make me choose between some really tough choices on Friends Pitching Fantasy, and this is a series I've really wanted to read. He's just made it impossible to choose it, so hopefully next time he prepares me a little better, but anyone that's upset can blame him. Fantology does touch on a series that I would also strongly recommend for fans of Abercrombie, and that's the Poppy War Trilogy by Rebecca Kwong. Kwong didn't come to my mind at first when I was preparing my own recommendations, and then when I read Fantology's tweet, I was like, of course, read Rebecca Kwong, because they're both really grimdark, I would say. They both have excellent characters, and they both have like a refreshing take on a lot of common fantasy tropes. Rin from the Poppy War, she just kind of blazes her own path, and the way she handles these common scenarios that we might see in fantasy books like these is super fresh and original. And Dylan and I think as a character she's really, really great, but as a person, not so great. And that's
Rin,
something
that is.
Rin.
I don't want people to think you're talking about Rebecca Kwong.
Oh yeah, I'm talking about Rin, the book character.
Yes.
I don't know Rebecca Kwong personally. She seems great, but Rin is a character that we love, and I said character, but as a person, she's not great, and that kind of describes pretty much every character in the first Law. So, I mean, the parallels there are really strong. So, I would highly recommend Poppy War Trilogy.
Yeah, I also think that Rebecca Kwong's work with Rin's character arc displays a very strong understanding and like display of psychology as well. And I think that she's got such a great and unique voice, does Rebecca Kwong. Very different from Joe Abercrombie's, but it does stick out that both of them have this very fresh voice with very like dialogue is something that sticks out for me with both of them for different reasons. But I love how Rebecca Kwong's dialogue in the Poppy War Trilogy reads extremely contemporary and modern, and it makes it so much easier to read. Her pacing is a lot quicker than Joe's, I would say.
Right.
Quicker than about anyone's, right? Like she moves at breakneck pace, and I mean that in all the best ways. But when I do hear people, Charles and I love fast moving books, and when I do hear people lament things about the Poppy War Trilogy, it's usually the pacing that you don't get to sit around with things and process, but I do think that's all very deliberate to kind of stories that Rebecca Kwong tells. And I'll also say that Evan Winter, I've heard amazing things about his work. I've seen interviews with him, like he's Daniel Green, booktuber extraordinaire, has interviewed Evan Winter, and Evan Winter has very insightful things to say about the genre and writing. And I have The Rage of Dragons sitting on my shelf mocking me. So I will get there. Charles and I will get there. I do think Fantology did do an episode. I don't want to make that as a promise because I didn't double check, but I think they did do an episode on The Rage of Dragons as well. So if you've read that, you want to hear more, you can check them out.
That's good to hear. Yeah, I wasn't too familiar with The Rage of Dragons, but if Fantology recommends it and it seems like you're excited to get around to it as well, well, just put it on the TBR. Put it on there.
Charles, Lord of the TBR, said it himself.
I don't know how that TBR, but the, just general TBR, the pile behind me, but not like on the reading schedule. That's like a very careful process. But one day soon, hopefully, Fantology recommends it, especially in this Abercrombie recommendations, and we're such huge Abercrombie fans. These will definitely make it to the short list. Another author that we really love, recommended by Justin T. Call at Justin_T_Call. he goes on to recommend one that was at the top of my recommendation list as well, which
Mm-hmm.
is the Broken Empire series by Mark Lawrence. Justin says it's every bit as dark as Abercrombie's books, parentheses, maybe darker, and it has its own unique flavor of humor. It's hard for me to decide which book is darker. They're both like dark in their own horrifically fascinating ways.
Right.
but Broken Empire definitely kind of takes some of that stuff to 11. It's, just as twisted as Abercrombie's most twisted characters, if not more so. It's very modern. It's got a lot of grimdark fantasy elements, and I would say where it kind of splits off is Broken Empire. It's I don't know. I don't want to get into spoilers, so I'm going to
I
redact what
can
I was going to say.
I can
But
say some.
yeah, go
I
for
think
it.
where it's split, if you're trying to say what makes them different,
Yeah.
I would say that the Broken Empire is much more focused on one particular character.
Yes.
It's, well, Abercrombie's work takes you through that rotating point of view
Mm-hmm.
bit.
A la
Mark
Game of Thrones.
Lawrence, a la Game of Thrones, Lawrence will make you sit in the perspective of Yorg, which is not always very pleasant. It's very good to read and it's very enjoyable in that sense, but it's a very dark place to be in, is Yorg's perspective.
Yeah.
And I'll say, too, that Abercrombie is a slower burn on how he gets to the grimdark elements in his work. He's got such a big reputation for being Lord Grimdark at this point that we all know going in and expect it. But if you
Right.
were just picking up the blade itself and reading it for the first time, I don't think you'd be as quick to note, like, oh, this is super, like, grimdark as
Broken
you
Empire,
were
you'd know in the
Broken
first
Empire, you know
paragraph.
very quickly. And I do, yeah, this one I always want to make sure I give a content warning for sexual violence if you're going to get into it. Charles and I definitely enjoy the Broken Empire
Oh yeah.
series, and we appreciate all of Mark Lawrence's work that we've gotten to. I mean, my favorite of Mark Lawrence's work is the Book of the Ancestor,
Mm-hmm.
of what I've read anyway, and I think though Broken Empire is probably a better fit for book recommendations for fans of the First Law because of how grimdark it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep, I would agree. There's just some really great moments that happen in the
Yep.
Broken Empire series that have stuck with me all these years after I've read it. And Mark Lawrence, friend of the show as well. You cannot go
Friend
wrong.
of the show, Mark Lawrence.
That's right. So definitely check out the Broken Empire series.
Definitely do that.
Justin also recommends another series that I have never read. Dylan, maybe you have some experience with it. The Raven's Mark series by
Yes.
Edward David MacDonald.
Yes, Charles, I do have experience with Ed McDonald's Raven's Mark series. I actually have this as, I would say, my number one underrated recommendation
Wow.
for fans of Joe Abercrombie's work.
Okay.
And like I was saying earlier, a very hard balance to find that Abercrombie finds so well is this: it's really gritty and dark, but it's also funny with lots of great voice. And that's what makes it sometimes hard to
Oh.
recommend stuff for fans of Abercrombie, because it's like, well, I don't know, like, do you like the funny stuff or the dark stuff or the
Right.
both? And if
Right.
it's the both, then Ed McDonald's work is a great fit. And I would say, much like the Broken Empire, it's much more centralized to one character. That's Rahel Galharo, who's a great anti-hero. I think I did mention him in our anti-heroes episode, if I'm remembering correct. Our favorite anti-heroes, or what do we call it? Anti-heroes that stole our hearts. Was
Yeah,
that it,
yeah,
Charles?
yeah.
Yeah. So I think I did bring up the main character from the Raven's Mark series in that one, and very complex, interesting character, very focused to his arc, and gritty, dark, funny, lots of things that you'd want if you're a Joe Abercrombie fan.
Very well said. Another one to add to my TBR pile. There's some overlap between Justin and another Twitter user called Micah Hall at Mix number 5, MASTA number 5, Micah. and they just have a bunch of recommendations here. First off, we have The Broken Empire and Red Queen's War by Mark Lawrence. Broken Empire, we highly recommend. I've never read Red Queen's War. Have you, Dylan?
No, I actually have not read Red Queen's War by friend of the show Mark Lawrence, but if it's anything like everything else I've read by friend of the show Mark Lawrence, I imagine I would like it a lot. In fact, the character, Jalan, from what I can gather, it's got that opening line that I grab sometimes, even though I haven't read the book. That's like, I don't have it in front of me now, but it's like, I'm a liar, a cheat, and a something else. You know that one, Charles?
No, I
Definitely.
don't.
Okay. Well, it's got one of my favorite opening lines. Definitely check that one out. And I think if you like more of these like roguish types, that's the sense I get from the main character there.
Hmm.
And again, like we don't usually have to have read it to feel confident that you'll enjoy Mark Lawrence's work with everything that we have seen from him.
For
So,
sure. Have you
yep,
read any of these other series recommended by Micah here? I know you can see the list.
right. So also recommended The Empires of Dust by Anna Smith Spark. That one I have not read. If I'm correct here, Anna Smith Spark, I think, came up at another point too, and I've heard that, or it like comes up on another thing that we'll get to later, I think.
Hmm.
I've heard that Anne Smith Spark does do very grimdark writing, but the prose is. Oh, yeah, there's a comment on this. I
Right.
think you all would really enjoy the above. Just be forewarned about Anna. She's awesome, but her prose style is like that of Cormac McCarthy, very stylized but epic.
Hmm.
So maybe for some of those folks who are coming off Lord of the Rings and liked that epic prose style that Tolkien captures very well,
Huh.
but wants a more grimdark version of it, then I would imagine Anna Smith Spark might be providing that for you. I don't know from experience
Huh.
with her work.
Well, there
And
is
then
another
Raven,
Twitter
yeah,
user that we've had on this list that also mentioned Anna Smith Sparks, and that's I'll just mention them
yeah,
really quickly, and then we can get back to the rest of his
sure.
recommendations. But we have Shauna at Shauna L
Oh,
Writes,
hi
and
Shauna, if you're listening.
hello, and they say anything by Anna Smith Sparks is a great
Okay,
place to start. The prose, oh, the prose! It's a thing of delight.
right.
That is
The
what we.
pros coming up a lot with Anna Smith Sparks, and her her Twitter handle, Anna Smith Sparks, is at Queen of Grimdark. Is that accurate? Might want to
Um,
double check that one at some
that's what
point. But
Shauna tweeted.
eh, so I think that, I mean, clearly Anna Smith Spark is playing off of the Grimdark Twitter handle names. So I would imagine it's at Queen of Grimdark is Anna Smith Spark, apparently. So,
Oh, okay. So the is was maybe left over from some spacing issues,
oh, yeah, the
typos.
yeah, I think that just got clustered together here. So it's at Queen of Grimdark is a good place to start.
Yes,
And
there
there
we
goes the
go.
pros of the pros. Okay, so
We
we
got
worked
it.
that one out, and seems like Anna Smith Spark is a very good recommendation if you're looking for that more stylized version of the grimdark genre. And that's an interesting combination. I would be very interested. We can add that to your nebulous
Yes.
TBR, Charles.
Yes,
That
thank
doesn't
you.
mean anything.
It means that it's on my radar, just
Right,
not going to read it anytime soon because we
for
have to
sure.
read like 6 other flippin' Abercrombie books and then 11 other Wheel of Time books. So it's any other book kind of goes into the nebulous pile for now and
Right. No,
until
we are
we put a
excited.
bigger dent in what we have already committed to. So that is Anne Smith Spark. Definitely piques my interest there. I'm a big fan of prose. So back to Micah
Charles, fan
Hall's
of prose.
recommendations here. He's got Raven's Mark by Ed McDonald, which Dylan so expertly covered already. But, if it's coming up multiple times, you got to know that we're on to something here. That's always good to see. And then anything by K.J. Parker. And then Micah says, try Sharps or The Folding Knife. Have you heard of any of these books, Dylan?
I've I've heard KJ Parker on an interview before, I believe, and definitely enjoyed listening to that interview, but I can't speak to Parker's work.
All right, all right. Well, worth looking into at least.
Yeah, haven't read it is what I mean when I
Right.
say I can't speak to it.
So this next Twitter user, Tress Churchill, Tres Churchill at Tres Churchill, they say a couple series, and the first one they say has come up a couple times, and this is Books That Scratch the Itch for Me, Powder Mage by Brian McClellan for characters in politics. And I have not read Powder Mage. I know a lot about the background of Brian McClellan and a lot about the background of this book, but Dylan, you've actually read it, so maybe you can provide more insight here.
Yeah, Powder Mage is one that came up multiple times, I believe. I think it might come up also on Instagram at some point, but I'll say that it's it's a great series. It's by Brian McClellan, who is well known as being someone who took Brandon Sanderson's class at BYU.
Yeah.
I think McClellan took the class twice and felt as though he showed a lot of improvement, or at least Sanderson felt as though he showed a lot of improvement between those two times. Powder Mage is darker, I would say, than Sanderson's work tends to get. I'm not sure if I would quite classify it as grimdark, but it revolves around these powder mages who can basically like snort powder and use their magic powers to alter the course of bullets. And it's got this kind of showdown between this hard magic system powder mage folk side of things and these almost more old school typical wizard style mages who have a sort of soft magic system going on for them. So it's an interesting work regarding the like meta of it, which I think is something that Abercrombie does really well.
Well
Too is like
said.
be mindful of meta.
That is pretty awesome. Yeah, I mean, this is, anyone that's under the tutelage of Sanderson definitely has piqued my interest as well. And this one's come up a couple times by a couple of users, so definitely keep that one on your radar. Another one recommended by Tress Churchill is Kings of the Wild by Nicholas Eames. And this is another one that is famous for being rejected in Friends Pitching Fantasy by yours truly. But this one was the second, this one and Poor Gentleman Bastards, those two were the toughest ones to not choose. And this one for me is like, I love rock and roll, and that seems to be a big influence in the story. And then like this kind of embrace of the humor and the fun in fantasy has always piqued my interest, and I'm very, very excited to read this series when we get to it, which is hopefully soon. And I understand that it is quite funny as well, so that just makes me even more interested.
Well said, Charles. I like to say it balances humor and heartfelt.
Humor and heartfelt. I like those things. Another one that I want to bring up because I think it's a really interesting recommendation. We have Drew McCaffrey at DCAF Writing, and they recommend The Acts of Cain by M.W. Stover. And they say that this should be required reading for Abercrombie fans. And I can see the similarities. I mean, I love Heroes Die. That's the only book from The Acts of Cain that I've read. And although it's a series, you could definitely read Heroes Die as a standalone. And I would highly recommend picking that up if you haven't, because for me, it's the action that stands out. Abercrombie, like in my second read through, I appreciated his action scenes so much more. I mean, they're just fantastic. They're not like the traditional epic battles that you think of, but the way he writes action is very exciting, very blow by blow, very dramatic, and also sometimes kind of funny. Characters like slipping and sliding around. It's not pretty, it's not stylized, but it's always very real and exciting. And the Acts of Cain delivers on that kind of violence as well. It's not funny ever. It's a very serious, he's like a action hero kind of protagonist, but he does some really cool stuff in the depiction of fighting, and the blow by blow is very exciting. So those two parallel each other super well for that reason.
Well said, Charles. I think you always have been a great advocate of the
Heroes
of
Die.
Heroes Die by Matthew
I
Stover,
should
and
read the
Drew
other ones.
McCaffrey spoke about this in more detail as a feature on Fantasy for the Ages podcast when they did their fantasy draft, but not that kind of fantasy draft,
Right.
fantasy fellowship draft. So you can hear him espouse the greatness further of Heroes Die on that podcast.
Very well said. And I know we're kind of wrapping up on our time, Dylan. So I would invite you to take a close look at some of the rest of these users and see if there's anyone you definitely want to bring up. We've got time for a few more here.
Okay, Charles. Well, I'll want to make sure that we give a shout out to our buddy David S. at Book
Of course.
Meanderings,
Good pick.
who mentioned We Are the Dead by Mike Shackle. And I have heard a lot of great things about that book. I also have heard great things about Forgetting Moon by Brian Lee Durfee. And that's another one that David S. recommended. David S. said both of those are the closest I've come to the gritty, almost nihilistic feel of Abercrombie's novels.
Huh.
And we have some other folks who are saying great stuff here that we'll keep rolling with. Words Matter, that's at Jenny KNZ, recommended The Grey Bastards and The True Bastards by Jonathan French, and also mentioned Kings of the Wild and Bloody Rose by Nicholas Eames. The bit here that I want to make sure that we touch on is Jenny KNZ saying, characters dealing with systems of moral ambiguity, unavoidable violence, bleak humor, politics and power dynamics, magic as a tool, mix up James Bond on a budget with X-Files and The Thick of It, or Yes Minister, with choices like which elder god to negotiate with. And that was in reference to the Grey Bastards, the True Bastards, and the Band books by Nicholas Eames.
Very well said.
Yeah, well, there's a few more that we definitely want to make sure that we mention here, Charles. So,
yep.
I want to give a shout out to Nils Shukla at Nils Reviews It. And Nils said, I'd recommend The Dragons of Terra Trilogy by at Brian Nasl, which I think is Brian Nasland. They're humor, plenty of banter, fantastic battles, complex characters, and anti-heroes, an environmental theme, and dragons. And I think Nils is onto something there when it comes to good recommendations for fans of the First Law series.
Always love me a good dragon story.
Right. We also got another nod from Jack Shelton at JShelton89 for Mike Shackle's work. That was We Are the Dead. So,
nice.
Yep, said really scratched that grimdark itch for me last year as a big Abercrombie fan. And Charles, I think no discussion of recommendations for fans of at Lord Grimdark's work would be better than that provided by Grimdark magazine itself, right?
Wow, that's a great source.
Right, and that's at Adrian G.D. Madge, and they recommended Luke Skoll and Alex Marshall. On Luke Skoll, that's the author of The Grim Company, which the little pitch here for that was the difference between a hero and a killer lies in the ability to justify dark deeds. But this is the age of ruin, and there are no heroes.
Sounds very Abercrombie
right.
to me.
Exactly. And then Alex Marshall, author of A Crown for Cold Silver. The pitch for that one was 5 villains, 1 legendary general, a final quest for vengeance. So you can see Grimdark magazine knows they're Grimdark. Those sound like great recommendations too.
For sure. Though I think we've got time for one more, unless you think otherwise, Dylan. Feel free to interrupt me. But the one that might be the most obvious recommendation comes from Twitter user Lorraine Bondi at Bondi Lorraine, and they say, "Never thought I would like Grimdark. Then I read First Law and was freaking amazing. Abercrombie's characters are brilliant, and his battle scenes are gritty and real. Can't think of anyone who comes close." You did the Age of Madness is what they're recommending, which is the next trilogy that takes place in the First Law universe after all the First Law books. So yes, if you like the First Law trilogy, then you should check out the Age of Madness trilogy by Joe Abercrombie. And you know what, Dylan? I think we can put that one on the official TBR list.
Yeah. Yeah, it already is. So thank you, Charles, for your great generosity around that one. Can I mention at least one more, Charles?
Sure.
I think we're doing actually all right time wise.
We got time for one more.
Right. So that would be from Ryan Copeland at Ryan Copeland 6, and that's Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurdy, which I actually don't think is a fantasy book, which is interesting. They said not fantasy, but Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurdy is a must for fans of the First Law. And we had Edward Gwynn at Edward GDM, who you may know from his BookTube channel with his brother Will, the brothers Gwynn, also son of John Gwynn. It was another great author you might want to check out if you're a fan of the First Law. And Edward said, "Okay, absolutely, this is the best rec. Larry McMurdy is awesome, and his characters are quirky and hilarious. What happens to them is just downright brutal. There's little joy. Perfect for Abercrombie fans."
Little joy indeed. Oh my goodness. So it's not fantasy, huh? It's like historical fiction, I guess.
Yeah, I think that it might even be Western. I gotta check. I checked right when they first recommended it.
Lonesome Dove by Larry McMurdy. All right.
Yeah, it's Western.
Oh,
1985 Western novel by American writer Larry McMurdy. And yeah, I mean, especially Red Country by Joe Abercrombie has a more Western feel. So I wouldn't be surprised if McMurdy may have inspired a little bit of that.
Wow. Well, it's been a while since I've read a good Western, but that sounds like a really, really good rec for First Law fans. Thank you, Ryan Copeland. Thank you, Edward Gwynn. It's very exciting. And you know what, Dylan? There were so many people that entered. We don't know if we got to everybody, but thank you all for throwing out a recommendation. I mean, this was super fun. I love talking First Law, as I know you do as well, Dylan. So to see a lot of these books come up over and over, a lot of them we have experience with, some I've not, which is very exciting. Yeah, it was just great. A bunch of great books talked out here. A lot of great people showing up and adding to the conversation. And I don't know, just a whole lot of fun. And I had a great time talking through all these amazing First Law recommendations.
Well said, Charles. Yeah, thank you so much to the fantasy community over on Twitter for providing these recommendations. We really appreciate it. We're sorry for anyone that we might have missed, but we appreciate every single person who came out and provided recommendations.
That's right. And you know what? You can check us out on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with the number 1 at the end, where we do these kinds of things all the time. And I'm sure Dylan's going to have one cooking up shortly after this episode comes out. Right, Dylan?
I'm sure I absolutely will, Charles.
You heard it here first, folks. So definitely be on the lookout for that. And if there's nothing left, Dylan, I think we can go ahead and play that sweet, sweet outro music.
I think it's time to play that sweet, sweet outro music, Charles.
All right. thank you, everybody, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. If you like what you heard today, you want to support the show, you want to be part of the conversation, want to throw us some recommendations the next time we do one of these kinds of episodes, then please check us out on Twitter. That's where all the magic's happening, over on the FTF podcast with a number 1 at the end. We're also on Facebook and Instagram at the FTF podcast, and you can shoot us an email directly at the ftfpodcast@gmail.com. Now, Dylan, if they still wanted to support the show even more and they just so happen to be listening on an Apple device through Apple Podcasts, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast. Just scroll down on that Apple Podcast page until you start seeing stars on the Friends Talking Fantasy section of the Apple Podcast page. And when you start seeing stars, then we would love it if you clicked 5 of those stars. If you do have a little bit of extra time, then leaving a review is super helpful for a podcast like ours. Help people find our podcast. But you know what? Just listening and getting to this point, that is more than enough. We are so grateful.
Just listening, guys, that's more than enough. You're super awesome. Thank you so much for being here, making it all the way to the end. You're a rock star. Thank you. And as always, go forth and conquer, friends.